John Noe unveils Greater Than We Believe with your host, Stephen King.
Well, hi there. Welcome back. My name is Stephen King. This is my friend John Noe. We are bringing you another in a series of videos, of Bible teaching videos called Greater Than We Believe. This week we are still on the same playlist that we were last week. The playlist name is The All Controversy, and this is having to do with the idea of we had been talking about hell. And in the same book, Hell Yes, Hell No, we've finished talking about the term hell and eternal torment, but we've continued the discussion to talk about, well, what about the rest of the dead that aren't in Christ or aren't already saved? And the Bible has some specific things to say about them, where they are, their condition, and what, so forth and so on. But we talked about the very early church. For the first 500 years of the early church, they actually had the majority opinion was what we would nowadays call universal salvation, which is a very touchy subject right now among Christians. And so what we're doing is we're looking at the history of what the early church taught, where it started making changes, whether or not those were scriptural or not, and so forth and so on. We're basically going to give you the facts of what we found, let you make your own decisions. So this week, John, the name of the video is called Changed to Heretical. And this was right after the time of Alexandria when they started making some major changes. Augustine, excuse me, you're right. So go ahead and continue on with what you were talking about last week.
Well, during the time of Augustine, things started to change because of the reasons we laid out in our last video. And many who believed in universalism felt like the opposite doctrine was now necessary to alarm the multitudes with. In other words, the why, according to the Universalist writer again, John Wesley Hansen, the wise could accept truths, but they were not to be taught to the multitude. What does that mean? Well, they needed false threats were necessary to keep the common people in check. It is termed the Doctrine of Reserve. In Latin, it was known as fros pia, and meaning fraud plus pious. Hence, the truth was intentionally held in reserve from the ignorant masses, and false doctrine was taught to them for their own good. That
sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Does that have any familiarity in our day and time?
Yes.
Well, we won't get into that.
No.
But this was necessary, it was felt, according to Hansen again, this is his view, to control and deter them from sin, and to secure their obedience and restraint lest they take advantage of God's goodness. So you see the kind of motivation that is going on here, right?
Yes.
Now again, this is during the first 500 years of Christianity, where Christian universalism was the dominant view. Not the only view, but the dominant view. Meanwhile, the chosen few, the elite, secretly held on to their universalism. But they believed, but they did not entrust this truth to the masses. The fear of eternal punishment, it was felt, must be kept always in front of those people's eyes as the prop of human and divine authority, according to this writer, John Wesley Hansen. And the bottom line is, that the doctrine of reserve was a wretched and deceptive practice of teaching known falsehoods that the elite did not believe would be executed, but for the attainment of the greater good. And then, as we move toward the 6th century, in the year 544, has often been cited as the first time the doctrine of universal salvation was formally condemned and anathematized as heretical. Supposedly, this occurred during a local council of Constantinople, where 15 anathemas were charged against Origen, who died in 254. So this is what? What did I say? 544? And he lived in 240, that was 300, almost 300 years later. Yeah. One of those 15 was his, Origen's, view of universal salvation. And it must be pointed out that this council was boycotted by the Pope. And it was called instead by the emperor, the Roman emperor, Justinian, in East Rome. And Universalists, however, disagree with this account. Here is their take, quote, again, according to Hansen in this book. Historians and writers on the state of opinion in the early church have quite often erred in declaring that an ecclesiastical council pronounced the doctrine of universalism heretical as early as the 6th century. They contend that in 544 to 46, a condemnation of Origen's views of human salvation was attempted to be exhorted from a small local council in Constantinople by the Emperor Justinian, but his edict was not obeyed by the council. The council voted 15 canons, and not one of them condemned universal restoration. Not one of the 9 anathemas ordered by Justinian was sanctioned by the council. And Justinian was unable to compel the bishops under his control to condemn the doctrine he hated, but which they must have favored. Furthermore, they maintained that the age of Justinian that condemned Origen is conceded to have been the vilest of the Christian centuries, and the doctrine of hell, of literal fire and endless duration, have begun to be an engine of tyranny in the hands of an unscrupulous priesthood and tyrannical emperor, and moral degradation had kept pace with the theological decline. All this contrasted with the age of Origen, as it was to say, night to day. But the bottom line historical fact is Origen was officially declared a heretic in the Second Council of Constantinople some 9 years later in 553, a 5th overall council. The legacy of the greatest early church theologian and his illuminating writings were cast out of the church. So in the first council, didn't get through.
Couldn't get it.
But 9 years later, in what would be the 5th council,
yes,
it did. And with that, this travesty, as Hansen terms it, this travesty, the destruction of the original Christian theology and its replacement by the Roman Church tradition was virtually completed. And Hansen goes on, he says, from this time on, Origen could no longer be tolerated and was at length condemned, and the doctrine of eternal punishment reigned. Latin became the language of Christianity, and Augustinian system and followers used it as their instrument for molding Christianity from that time and forward. Augustinians' inventions and original inherited depravity, predestination, and endless hell torments became the theology of Christendom. According to Hansen.
Yeah.
Now this is contested, as we'll see. Consequently, The broad faith of primitive Christianity paled and failed before the lurid terrors of Augustinianism. It vanished in the 6th century and while it remained in the East a while, and only ceased when Augustinianism and Catholicism and the power of Rome ushered in and fostered the darkness of the Dark Ages. The modern Orthodox view as to the doctrine of eternal punishment as opposed to final restoration were not fully developed and established till the middle of the 6th century. So we had the first 500 years, and now we have this transition, and then we have the establishment and change. And that they were not established through argument, but they were established by imperial authority. Origen, this chief universalist of the centuries immediately succeeding the apostles, was by general consent the most erudite and saintly of all Christian fathers. Historians, scholars, and critics, again, this is written by Hansen, a universalist. The historians, scholars, critics, men of all shades of thoughts and opinion emulated one another in exalting his name and praising his character. No one, quote, did more and suffered more for the truth of Christ than any man after the 1st century of our era. Origen did more than any other man to win the old world to the Christian religion. And with the possible exception of Augustine, Origen is the most distinguished and most influential. But in the 6th century, the church, disowned him. Disowned its author, is how Hansen puts it. In conclusion, Universalists feel that Origen's death is the real end of free Christianity. Comparisons and conclusions here, Stephen. The most powerful minds, 300 to 400 AD, adopted the doctrine of universal restoration. Those who did not adopt it entered into no controversy about it with those who did. This is part of the transition. And the principal ancient universalists were Christian-born and reared and were among the most scholarly and saintly of all the ancient saints. In contrast, the most celebrated of the earlier advocates of endless punishment were heathen-born and led corrupt lives in their youth. Tertullian was one of the first, and Augustine the greatest of those who confessed to have been and confessed to have been among the vilest. In retrospect, then, universalism, this teaching was strongest where the language of the New Testament was a living tongue Greek in the Greek fathers, and declines as knowledge and purity declined, and it changed to Latin. On the other hand, endless penalty is most strongly taught precisely in those quarters where the New Testament was less read in the original Greek, and also in the most corrupt ages of the church. In summary, again, according to Hansen, a universalist, in summary, again, the contrast between Origen's system and Augustine's system is that of light and darkness. With the first, fatherhood, love, hope, joy, and salvation. With the other, vengeance, punishment, sin, and eternal despair. With Origen, God triumphs in final unity. With Augustine's, man continues in endless rebellion. And God is defeated, and an eternal dualism prevails. The doctrine of endless punishment assumed in the writings of Augustine a prominence and rigidity that had no parallel in earlier history of theology. But the submergence of Christian universalism in the dark waters of Augustine's Christo-paganism, and after having been prevailing as a theology of Christendom for 5 centuries, is one of the strange phenomena of history of religious thought. Hence, the doctrine and belief of universal salvation is not, as many think, something new, but it is toward the position of the early Christians, and its rebirth is a restoration of Christianity to its primary purity, according to today's Universalists, and back to the earliest anti-Nicene authorities and the true church fathers. Today, Christian Universalists ask a poignant question. If the doctrine of universal salvation was the creed of the majority, perhaps the large majority, of Christians in the East and the West, and did not hinder the early church for the first 500 years, why should it now? In summation, modern-day Christian Universalist Gary Armerault comparatively writes, when one looks at the lives of those Christian leaders who brought the doctrine of eternal torment into the church, we find a string of envyings, power plays, persecutions, character assassinations, book burnings, murders, and tortures. They became like God, the created tormentor. They exchanged the truth for a lie. They brought darkness into the world, the Dark Ages. Idolatry, corruption, rewriting history, inquisitions, crusades, relics, cutting up the bodies of saints and making money off of them as good luck charms, indulgences, selling certificates to sin, witch hunts, Mary worship, corrupt popes, and torment, much torment, all in the name of Jesus Christ. Schaff, in his book, The History of the Christian Church, concludes that those times, that they amounted therefore in great measure to paganizing and secularizing of the church, and the temporal gain of Christianity was in many respects canceled by this scriptural loss. It smuggled heathen manners and practices into the sanctuary under a new name of exclusivism.
Were they woke too?
I guess they woke up,
Yeah.
so to speak. Well, we have one more to go.
Okay. Oh, is this one done?
This was.
Okay.
I'm going to stop there. We'll pick up there.
Sure.
In our next video.
Okay. Well, we're starting to see a nasty, ugly trend in history there where things started to switch.
Oh.
And we're going to continue.
According to the Universalist take.
Yeah.
Now this is contested.
Okay.
And we'll get into that.
Okay. So next week's video is going to be called Contested History. So that's what we're going to do is find out.
There's another. That was one side of the story.
Yeah.
Now we'll look at the other side.
Okay. So y'all come back and see us. God bless you. Bye-bye. All right.